We've seen demand elasticity, which describes the way that the quantity demanded responds to the change in price. So the percentage change in demand as a ratio to the percentage change in price is what we really call price elasticity of demand. But there are lots of other kinds of elasticity. You can talk about the income elasticity of a consumer. So if there's a percentage change in the income of a consumer, how much does that change the demand of a consumer? So let's write down the formula for price elasticity. Remember, it was dq dp times p over q. You can write down the income elasticity, which would be dq dy, right? So the rate at which the quantity demanded changes as we change income times y divided by q. So that would be the income elasticity. You could define cross-price elasticities. Remember that we saw how the demand for pork depended on the price of beef, for example. So you can define a cross-price elasticity, which describes the way the demand for one good responds to changes in prices of other goods. So for example, we could write, if Q is the demand for pork, we could write down the derivative of the demand for pork with respect to the price of beef times price of beef divided by the quantity of pork that's demanded. This would be the cross-price elasticity of the demand for pork with respect to the price of beef. So there's all these different types of elasticities that we could write down. And depending on the questions that we're trying to answer, you'll want to use the appropriate notion of elasticity. Now, are there elasticities of things that are not demand? Of course, we could talk about supply elasticity. So just like we talk about the percentage change in quantity demanded per percentage change in price, we could do the same exact thing. We could talk about the ratio of the percentage supplied with respect to a percentage change in the price. So just like the demand elasticity, it's going to be dq over dp times p over q. One big change is going to be that unlike a demand function, a supply function doesn't necessarily have a negative sign for the derivative of quantity with respect to price. In fact, typically it's going to be a positive number. So supply elasticity is typically going to be positive. So for our pork example, remember supply function was 88 plus 40p. So we could calculate the supply elasticity at the price of 330 and the quantity of 220. So we could take the derivative of quantity with respect to price. So if I take the derivative of this with respect to price, we just get 40. And then we multiply that times p over q. So p is 330, q is 220. So we plug those in and we find that the supply elasticity is 0.6. So this is typically, like I said, going to be positive value, and in the rare cases where you have a downward sloping supply curve, it would be negative valued. So just like with the demand curve, you could move up and down the supply curve and look at what happens to the value of supply elasticity. Right? Again, just like the demand elasticity, it's going to depend on P and Q. In particular, depend on the ratio of P over Q. If the supply elasticity is 0, then we say that supply is perfectly inelastic. If supply elasticity is infinite, we say it's perfectly elastic. Anything between 0 and 1 is what we consider inelastic, and anything bigger than 1 is elastic. We use the Greek letter eta, by the way, to represent supply elasticity. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of elasticity is what happens to elasticity over time. Let's go back to demand elasticity. Whether you're talking about the short run or the long run is going to matter for what the elasticity should be. Because as we saw, if a good is easily substituted, then that's going to be a very different situation than where a good has no reasonable substitutes. So in the short run versus the long run, your ability to substitute a good is going to vary. So for example, an electric car is not going to be a good substitute for a gas car in the short run, right? You might not have a charging station. You might not you might not have the infrastructure for charging. But in the long run, those would be much easier to install, and so it would actually be a pretty good substitute. On the other hand, in the short run, it's easy to switch between a Mac and a PC. If you're not locked into any particular apps or software, you can just pick whichever one you want. But once you've gotten accustomed to using a particular platform, or you've gotten accustomed to using certain software, in the long run, it becomes very difficult to switch between Mac and PC. So in this particular example, if you're talking about the long run, they aren't good substitutes, but in the short run, they are. So the lesson here is that the easier it is to substitute a good, the more elastic demand it is going to be. And this kind of reasoning is going to apply for supply as well.